It was a bright and sunny morning at one of the most famous historical landmarks in the world. Tourists from all over the globe gathered to visit the iconic site, eager to take pictures and capture memories of their trip. Among them was an arrogant tourist, a young man who thought he was clever and funny. He had traveled across the world, but it was clear that he was more interested in making himself the center of attention than in appreciating the beauty of the place. As he walked around the grounds, he noticed something that caught his eye. A soldier standing still, dressed in a traditional military uniform, guarding a very important monument. The soldier's uniform was crisp and neat, and his hat, a tall, furry headpiece, was the perfect detail for a picture. The tourist's eyes lit up. He thought to himself, "This is the perfect shot. I'll take a picture with the soldier's hat. It will be hilarious." He smirked as he approached the guard. The soldier stood tall, his face serious and unmoving, his posture straight as a rod. It was clear the guard was doing his job, standing in place with a quiet authority that others couldn't help but respect. But the tourist wasn't like the others. He wasn't there to admire the soldier's duty or the importance of the historical site. He was there to make a spectacle. The tourist leaned toward his friend, who was busy taking photos of the monument, and whispered, "Watch this. I'm going to take that soldier's hat for a funny picture. It's going to be great." His friend, not fully aware of the situation, just shrugged and smiled, thinking it was just another one of the tourist's usual jokes. With an air of confidence, the young man slowly walked toward the guard, trying to act casual but clearly filled with excitement. As he got closer, he pretended to look at something on the ground, all while carefully studying the guard's hat. His plan was simple. He would reach out, snatch the hat off the guard's head, and take a quick picture. Surely, the guard would laugh along with him, and they'd all have a good time. As he got closer, he started to feel a sense of thrill. This wasn't just any hat. It was a symbol of authority, worn by the soldier to protect a piece of history. But the tourist didn't think about that. All he saw was an opportunity to show off in front of his friend. Without hesitation, the tourist reached out, thinking he could just grab the hat like it was any other costume. He barely touched the brim when he realized the guard hadn't moved an inch. The young man chuckled to himself, thinking, "Wow, this is going to be easier than I thought." But little did he know, he was about to learn a lesson that would completely change the way he looked at the situation. The moment his hand brushed the hat, everything changed. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, the energy shifted, and a chill ran down his spine. The soldier's eyes, which had been forward and unmoving, slowly turned toward him. The intensity in those eyes made the tourist's heart skip a beat. And then the silence hit. The guard's presence was no longer just about standing still, it was commanding. The young tourist suddenly felt out of place, unsure of what would happen next. He had no idea that his simple, thoughtless act was about to cause much more trouble than he could ever imagine. The tourist, still feeling confident, didn't notice the tension building around him. In his mind, he was already imagining the funny photo that would make his friends laugh. He could already hear their comments, their amusement at how bold he was to take the soldier's hat. "This will be hilarious," he thought, completely unaware of the serious situation unfolding. As he stood before the guard, he was so focused on his plan that he barely even took a moment to observe the man in front of him. The soldier, still standing at attention, showed no sign of reacting. His eyes were locked straight ahead, his body perfectly still, almost as if he was made of stone. The tourist, however, didn't understand the seriousness of the soldier's role. To him, it all seemed like a game, a small chance to stand out on his vacation. The guard, with his crisp uniform and stern expression, was much more than just a figure in a costume. He was there for a reason. His job was to protect the historical site and represent the pride of the country. But the tourist wasn't interested in any of that. He had a different idea. With a wide grin on his face, the tourist leaned forward and spoke to the guard, trying to make light of the situation. "Hey, come on, just for a second," he said, giving the guard a wink. "I'm just going to take the hat for a picture. It'll be quick, I promise." He then reached up, trying to grab the hat from the guard's head, convinced the soldier would just let him take it. The tourist thought, surely, the guard would smile or maybe chuckle at his boldness. After all, it was just a harmless joke, right? But when his fingers brushed against the hat, nothing happened. The soldier didn't flinch, didn't budge. Instead, the atmosphere around them grew colder, heavier. The young man's hand hesitated for a moment, as if the air itself had changed. The tourist tugged again, thinking he hadn't reached the right angle. "Come on, let me just borrow it for a second," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. But still, the soldier didn't move. Now the tourist was confused. He had expected a different reaction. Maybe the guard would have said something, or at least made it obvious that he couldn't just take the hat. Instead, the soldier stood perfectly still, his eyes now slowly moving down to meet the tourist's gaze. It wasn't anger that the tourist saw in the guard's eyes, but something more unsettling. The soldier's expression was calm, but there was an authority in his eyes that made the young man's heart beat a little faster. For a moment, the tourist stopped. He wasn't sure what was happening. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. But still feeling a bit cocky, he tried to brush off the strange feeling creeping up inside him. He was the tourist here. He was in control. He reached for the hat once again, this time with even more determination. "I just want to take a picture," he said, his voice a little less confident than before. "Come on, let's make this fun." But the soldier didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the tourist, his face as still as stone. The tension was building, and the young man was starting to realize that this wasn't as simple as he thought. The silence was deafening, and it felt as though everyone around them was waiting for something to happen. The tourist's smile faded, and he began to feel a slight unease. He still didn't understand the full weight of the situation, but he could sense that something was about to change. The guard's presence was too strong to ignore. As the tourist's hand hovered just above the guard's hat, time seemed to slow down. The air around them felt thicker, heavier. The young man's fingers were still outstretched, ready to snatch the hat. But something in the guard's eyes stopped him. The soldier had not moved an inch, but the look in his eyes sent a shiver down the tourist's spine. It wasn't anger that the tourist saw, but an intense calmness that made the young man feel suddenly out of place. The guard's eyes had turned towards him with a quiet, unshakable intensity. It was as though the soldier was waiting, carefully watching every move the tourist made. The young man had only been thinking about getting a funny photo, but now, standing so close to the guard, he felt a sudden shift, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The tourist paused, his fingers still in the air. His confidence from just moments ago had begun to waver. He had thought the guard would just let him take the hat, maybe even laugh along with him. But now he wasn't so sure. For the first time, he was beginning to realize that this situation was different than anything he had imagined. Without saying a word, the soldier stood perfectly still, eyes locked on the tourist, showing no emotion on his face. He wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting. He was simply waiting. There was something almost unnerving about how quiet and calm he was. It was as though the soldier knew something the tourist didn't. And in that moment, the young man felt very small. The tourist felt a strange knot in his stomach. This wasn't just some harmless joke anymore. The atmosphere around them had changed completely. It was as if the guard was not just a figure of authority, but something much more powerful, unmovable, unshakable. The tourist looked around, realizing that people were starting to notice. Some of them had stopped what they were doing and were now watching the scene unfold, their eyes shifting between the tourist and the guard. The young man quickly looked back at the soldier. The guard hadn't moved a muscle, but his gaze was unwavering. The tourist's hand began to lower slowly, as if his body was finally understanding the seriousness of the moment. He didn't know what had come over him, but now he was sure this wasn't something to laugh about. The silence grew louder, almost deafening, and the crowd's attention grew sharper. The young man began to feel the weight of all those eyes on him. For a brief moment, he was unsure of what to do next. His mind raced. Should he apologize? Should he walk away? He couldn't remember ever feeling so out of place, so unsure. Just as the tourist was about to step back, something happened. The guard spoke, his voice clear and calm, cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. It wasn't loud, but it carried authority. "Do not touch my hat," the soldier said in a quiet, firm tone. The words sent a jolt through the tourist, and he immediately took a step back. He had never heard anyone speak with such quiet authority before, especially not in such a calm and measured way. It wasn't threatening, but it was a command. The guard's simple words had an impact far greater than any shout could have. The tourist felt his face flush with embarrassment. His hands, which had been so eager to reach for the hat, now hung by his sides, trembling slightly. His joke had backfired completely. What had seemed like a funny, harmless idea moments ago now felt like a huge mistake. The eyes of the crowd seemed to grow more focused on him, and he couldn't help but feel embarrassed by what he had just tried to do. He tried to smile nervously, but it didn't work. The seriousness of the moment was clear now. The guard had set boundaries, and the tourist had crossed them. There was no turning back now. The moment the guard spoke, the tourist felt his stomach tighten. The words echoed in his mind as he stood frozen in place, unable to move or respond. "Do not touch my hat." They weren't yelled, but the authority in the soldier's voice was undeniable. The young man could feel the weight of the command, and for the first time, he realized he might have made a serious mistake. The air around them felt thick, as if everyone around was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The crowd, which had been minding their own business just moments before, was now paying close attention to the scene that had unfolded. People looked from the soldier to the tourist, some with raised eyebrows, others with looks of concern. The young man could feel the eyes on him, the judgment hanging in the air. He took a step back, his hand slowly dropping to his side. His confidence had completely vanished, replaced by a wave of embarrassment. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The idea of grabbing the guard's hat had seemed so harmless at first. A quick photo, a funny moment. How could it have turned into something so serious? He glanced around at the onlookers. Some were whispering to each other, pointing at him with amusement. The tourist's face flushed red. He could feel the humiliation creeping up his neck, and his palms started to sweat. He had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The guard's posture remained unchanged, as steady as ever. He didn't react to the crowd's whispers or the tourist's nervous movements. His gaze was still locked on the young man, calm and unwavering. The tourist, now feeling smaller than ever, took a deep breath and mumbled an apology, but it felt hollow. His words seemed to have no weight compared to the guard's quiet strength. "I'm sorry," he said, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The soldier's stoic expression didn't shift. There was no smile, no softening of his face. He simply stood there, unmoving, as if the apology wasn't necessary or perhaps not even worth acknowledging. The tourist felt a pang of regret. This wasn't how he had imagined his visit would go. He had hoped for a laugh, a funny story to tell his friends later. Instead, he found himself standing in the middle of a tense situation, embarrassed and unsure of how to fix it. The crowd had started to disperse, but a few still lingered, watching with curiosity. It seemed as though the young man's mistake had turned into a spectacle for everyone around. Some were amused by his discomfort, while others looked at him with disapproval. The silence that followed the guard's warning was enough to make the tourist feel like everyone could hear his thoughts. He had underestimated the seriousness of the situation, and now, standing there in front of the soldier, he understood just how wrong he had been. The guard wasn't just a person in a uniform. He was a symbol of respect and authority, and the young man's thoughtless actions had disrespected that. The tourist tried to save face, offering a nervous laugh, but it sounded weak and forced. The whole moment felt surreal. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? He glanced at his friend, who had been watching from a distance, and saw the look of disbelief on their face. It wasn't a look of support or amusement. It was a look of surprise, mixed with disappointment. The young man knew then that this moment, this mistake, would stick with him far longer than any funny photo ever would. The tourist's apology hung in the air, but it didn't seem to do much. The guard still stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged. The young man's face was red with embarrassment. He had hoped that his apology would smooth things over, but it felt like it had fallen on deaf ears. The soldier's silence was deafening. In the back of his mind, the tourist could feel his confidence slipping away. He had always been the type to laugh things off, to brush off small mistakes. But this wasn't something he could laugh away. He hadn't just made a small mistake. He had crossed a line. As he stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, he realized how little he understood about the situation. Just moments ago, he had been full of bravado, thinking he could take the soldier's hat without any consequences. Now, he was facing the reality that his actions had disrespected something much bigger than himself. He looked at the soldier again. The guard's presence was undeniable. The calm, steady way the soldier carried himself made the tourist feel smaller and smaller. It wasn't just the uniform or the hat. It was the discipline, the authority that the soldier represented. The guard wasn't just standing there for no reason. He was protecting something important, something sacred. And in that moment, the tourist realized how little he had considered that before. The crowd had mostly moved on, but a few still lingered, watching the scene unfold. The tourist could feel their eyes on him, and it made the knot in his stomach tighten even more. He wanted to escape, to run away from the awkwardness that he had created. But he couldn't. He was stuck, standing there, surrounded by the quiet weight of his mistake. As the soldier stood before him, unyielding, the tourist began to feel a deep sense of regret. The moment of excitement he had felt earlier, when he thought it would be fun to take the hat, seemed so far away now. He had thought the guard would just let him. He never imagined that the situation could turn into something so serious. But now, standing face to face with the reality of his actions, he understood. "I didn't mean to disrespect you," the tourist said again, his voice quieter this time. His words felt more genuine now, less like a rushed apology, and more like an attempt to understand the gravity of the situation. The soldier didn't respond, but the young man could sense a shift in the air. There was no need for the guard to say anything more. His stillness, his calmness, had already spoken volumes. The tourist felt a wave of humility wash over him. He wasn't the center of attention here. He wasn't the one in control. The soldier was, and he always would be. For the first time in a long while, the tourist began to realize the true value of respect. He had always thought of respect as something simple, something earned through charm or cleverness. But now he understood it in a deeper sense. Respect wasn't about jokes or tricks. It was about recognizing the authority and the role of others, understanding their place, and appreciating the work they do. He looked down at the ground, feeling small, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure what to do next. The soldier hadn't yelled at him or forced him to leave. He hadn't made a scene, but his quiet authority had made an impact. The young man realized that he had learned something today, a lesson about humility, respect, and the weight of his actions. For the first time, the tourist felt out of place, not because of the people around him, but because of the way he had treated the soldier. And that realization, heavy as it was, would stay with him long after he left the site. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. The tourist stood there, feeling more out of place with each passing second. His apology had been made, but it hadn't solved anything. The guard was still watching him, and the atmosphere felt thick with tension. The young man glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could rescue him from this uncomfortable moment. But all he could see were strangers, some still whispering to each other, others staring at him with judgment. The crowd had grown in size, and the more people that gathered, the more the young man felt his embarrassment grow. He couldn't escape the attention that had shifted to him. Some of the tourists who had been taking photos of the monument now looked over, their eyes moving between him and the soldier. A few shook their heads in disbelief, while others seemed to be muttering to their friends, probably talking about the tourist's behavior. It felt as though the entire situation had become a spectacle, and the tourist was the main act. As the crowd murmured, the young man could hear some of the more sympathetic onlookers offering quiet words of advice, like, "He should have known better," or "It's not a joke." These comments only made him feel worse. He wasn't used to being the subject of attention like this, especially not in such a humiliating way. His nerves were on edge as his face grew even hotter, and he wished with all his might that he could just disappear. Still, the guard stood unmoving, his eyes never leaving the young man. The soldier's posture remained as stiff and formal as ever, yet there was something about the calmness that seemed to silence the entire scene. It was clear that the guard wasn't worried about the whispers or the looks of the crowd. He wasn't there for entertainment or to participate in any drama. He was simply doing his job, standing his ground. As the minutes passed, the tourist realized something that made his stomach churn even more. The people around them weren't just watching because it was a funny or unusual situation. They were watching because they recognized the importance of respect and discipline. They could see that the guard wasn't just a soldier in a uniform, but someone who represented something greater: tradition, responsibility, and the importance of boundaries. The tourist had crossed a line, and now the entire crowd was silently teaching him the same lesson. Respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. It wasn't about making jokes or trying to prove something. It was about recognizing the roles of others, understanding the value of their work, and acknowledging that some things, like the guard's duty, were not to be treated casually. The young man felt a deep sense of regret. He had never considered these things before. In his travels, he had taken so much for granted, laughing at things he didn't understand, trying to push boundaries without thinking of the consequences. Now, standing in front of the guard, with the weight of the crowd's attention on him, he understood just how wrong he had been. After what seemed like an eternity, the soldier finally took a step back, breaking the stillness. His posture softened slightly, but he still didn't speak. It wasn't a sign of approval, but it was clear that the situation was winding down. The tourist was left standing there, still unsure of what to do next, but feeling something he hadn't expected: humility. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some still casting glances at the tourist, while others continued on with their day. The young man remained frozen in place, feeling like he had just been taught a lesson that he wouldn't forget anytime soon. The soldier had not raised his voice, had not shouted or made a scene. He had simply stood his ground, and in doing so, had delivered a lesson in respect that the young man would carry with him for a long time. As the tourist turned to leave, he realized that this moment, though uncomfortable, would be one of the most important lessons he would ever learn. As the crowd began to thin, the tourist took a deep breath. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air, and he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. His face was still flushed, and his hands were trembling slightly. He tried to move, but his feet felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure of what to do next. He had come to the historical site expecting to have fun, to take some quirky photos, and make memories that would impress his friends. But now, all he could think about was the stern look in the soldier's eyes and the disappointment he had caused. The young man glanced back at the guard, who had returned to his usual position, standing tall and still. The soldier's face remained impassive, but there was something about his presence that seemed even more powerful now. It wasn't just the uniform or the hat. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet authority that surrounded him. The tourist couldn't help but admire the guard's ability to stay composed and unwavering in the face of such a disruption. The more the tourist thought about the situation, the more he realized how wrong he had been. What had seemed like a harmless joke earlier now felt foolish and disrespectful. He had been careless with his actions, not stopping to think about the consequences. The soldier wasn't just a figure in a uniform. He was a representative of something much greater. The young man had treated him as if he were nothing more than a prop for his amusement, and that thought made him cringe. As he walked away from the area, the tourist's mind continued to race. He could still feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some with judgment, others with curiosity. His friend, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, hadn't said much. The tourist had noticed the surprised look on their face, but they hadn't scolded him or laughed. Instead, they had been quiet, as though they understood the lesson that had just been handed to him. The young man couldn't help but feel ashamed. He had never seen himself as disrespectful, but now, in hindsight, he realized that his actions had spoken louder than words. He had taken the guard for granted, not realizing that he was more than just someone standing still in a uniform. The soldier's role was important, and the young man had disrespected that without even thinking twice. It was hard to accept, but the tourist had learned something valuable that day. Respect wasn't something that could be earned with a joke or a clever act. It wasn't about trying to get attention or make others laugh. Respect had to be earned through understanding, through recognizing the value of others and the work they do. The tourist had taken that for granted, and now he had learned the hard way. As he walked along, his mind cleared, and a sense of humility began to settle over him. The embarrassment of the moment still lingered, but he knew it was a feeling he had to carry with him. He wouldn't forget the soldier's calmness, the way the guard had stood his ground without a word. That was a strength the tourist could only hope to match someday. He glanced at his friend, who had finally caught up with him. They said nothing at first, but the silence spoke volumes. The young man had learned a lesson, and though it had been a tough one, it would stick with him. He was no longer the confident tourist who thought everything was a joke. He was someone who had learned the true meaning of respect, and that was a lesson that would stay with him forever. The tourist walked quietly, his mind still processing everything that had just happened. The words, "Do not touch my hat," kept echoing in his head, each repetition making him feel smaller and more regretful. He had made a foolish decision, and now he was left to deal with the consequences of his actions. As he walked along, trying to shake off the discomfort, he noticed how different everything seemed. The bustling crowd, the sounds of laughter and chatter, all felt distant now. His thoughts were occupied by the lesson he had just learned, the hard way. His friend, walking beside him, broke the silence. "Are you okay?" they asked, their tone soft, but there was an underlying concern in their voice. The tourist wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't want to make excuses for his actions. He knew what he had done wasn't right, and no words could change that. Instead, he just nodded quietly. I messed up," the tourist finally admitted. "I didn't mean to disrespect him. I thought it would be funny, but now I see how wrong I was." His friend gave him a sympathetic look, but didn't say anything more. They both knew there wasn't much to say. The tourist had learned the lesson, but it wasn't easy to swallow. It wasn't just about the soldier and his hat. It was about understanding boundaries, respect, and how easily one could cross a line without even realizing it. The tourist had acted out of impulse, without stopping to think about the significance of his actions. Now, he understood that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. As they continued walking, the tourist couldn't help but think back to the guard. The soldier had stood firm, never raising his voice, never becoming angry. The calm authority the guard had shown made the tourist realize how much power there was in stillness. The soldier had done nothing but remain composed, and yet his presence had been enough to stop the young man in his tracks. It was a lesson in how to maintain control, how to command respect without ever having to demand it. For the first time in a long time, the tourist felt humbled. He realized how often he had taken things for granted, assuming that everything was for his entertainment, for his amusement. But this experience had opened his eyes. The soldier wasn't there for the tourists' amusement. He wasn't part of a show. He had a job to do, and he did it with pride and dedication. The young man's thoughts shifted again, this time toward the crowd that had gathered. He had been the center of attention, but not for the reasons he had hoped. The whispers, the glances, they weren't full of admiration or laughter. They were filled with judgment, some with disapproval. He had felt all those eyes on him, and it had been uncomfortable. It was a feeling he didn't want to repeat, a feeling that had forced him to face the truth of his actions. As they reached a quieter part of the site, the tourist stopped and turned to his friend. "I don't think I'll forget this," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I've learned something today." His friend smiled gently. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that you learned from it." The tourist nodded, grateful for the understanding. The day had started with laughter and excitement, but it had ended with a much more important lesson, one that would stay with him far longer than any funny photo or joke ever could. From that day on, the young man knew he would approach situations differently. He would remember the soldier's quiet authority and the lesson that came with it. Respect wasn't something that could be earned through humor or attention. It was something that had to be given, freely and without expectation. And that was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the day went on, the tourist's mind remained focused on the lesson he had learned. Everything around him seemed different now. The laughter, the people taking pictures, the chatter, none of it held the same excitement for him anymore. He kept replaying the events in his head, thinking about how he had acted without thinking, how he had disrespected someone without realizing the full weight of it. The guard's stillness, his quiet authority, had made him feel small and humbled, but in a way, it was exactly what he needed. He didn't know why he had thought it would be funny to grab the soldier's hat. In hindsight, it seemed so childish, so careless. But now that he had experienced the impact of his actions, he understood how easy it was to overlook someone else's role, to treat something important as if it were just another joke. He realized that respect didn't come from being funny or attention-grabbing. It came from understanding and valuing others. Walking through the historical site, the tourist couldn't help but notice the soldiers who were still standing in place, guarding the monument. They were doing their jobs without complaint, without seeking attention, and it made him appreciate them in a way he never had before. They were not there to be part of a show. They were there because their role mattered, because they represented something important, something bigger than themselves. The tourist began to think about all the times he had taken things for granted. The small moments in life that he had treated lightly, assuming they were there for his entertainment. Whether it was the people he encountered or the places he visited, he had often overlooked the effort and dedication behind them. But now, he understood how much more there was to see, how much deeper everything went. Every person, every role, had its own importance, and it was time he started acknowledging that. His friend, who had been quietly walking beside him, spoke up again. "You know, I'm proud of you for realizing what you did," they said with a gentle smile. "It's easy to brush off a mistake and pretend it didn't matter, but you've learned something important." The tourist smiled back, though it wasn't the carefree smile he had worn earlier. This time, it was a smile of understanding. "I didn't realize how important it was," he admitted, "but now I do. I've learned that respect is more than just being polite. It's about recognizing the value in everyone and everything around you." His friend nodded, clearly understanding. "It's a hard lesson, but a valuable one, and you'll carry it with you." The tourist agreed, and as the day wore on, he felt a shift within himself. The mistake he had made was something he would never forget, but it wasn't something that would define him. Instead, it was the lesson he had learned from it that would shape him moving forward. He now knew that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. It was something to be earned by showing appreciation for others, for the roles they played, and for the importance of their work. As they made their way to the exit, the tourist looked back one last time at the guard, who was still standing firm in his position. The soldier had not changed, had not shifted in any way. But to the tourist, he seemed different now. He wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was a symbol of dignity and discipline. And the young man had learned, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to respect that. With a quiet sense of gratitude, the tourist walked away from the site, carrying with him the knowledge that his actions had consequences, and that respect wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding and valuing the people who made the rules matter. It was a lesson that, for once, he wouldn't forget.